Hey guys, Morten and Henning from FlippedNormals here, and in today's video we're taking a look at a Dark Souls environment and sort of the paint over and the grading process that we've gone through in order to achieve the result that we have. Grading and paint overs are super important for basically all of your renders and all of your paintings, so hopefully in this video you'll learn a thing or two that you can apply to your own stuff.
So let's jump into Photoshop and let's see how you can really improve your very nice renders from Blender in this case.
So this was a sort of Dark Souls inspired concept sort of set up in Blender 3D wise using scans and trying to get away with doing no modeling or shading or texturing whatsoever, and then lighting it in Blender and then finishing it off here in Photoshop. But this video is to show you the importance of grading and what you can do with post work. So this is the finished piece. If we take a look at the before picture here, this is what came out straight out of Blender. So this is just, all this is rendered with Eevee as well. Pretty cool that you can do this real time in Eevee, which means you can change the camera angle really quickly and sort of get a completely new scene if you want. But yeah, so I want to take you through this little Photoshop document of what has been done in post to sort of spice it up a little bit and focus the composition more.
Post work is something you should really do on every single one of your renders, no matter what it is. I see a lot of weird elitism in the industry where people are saying that it's, oh, this render here came straight from V-Ray. I haven't done any post work on it. Well, why not?
No, maybe you should.
Maybe you should have. Like in every single case I've seen, you should do some grading to it. Like renders out of 3D software, they look way too CG. You need to blur it a little bit, add a little bit of grain to it, maybe add some texture breakup, and just focus the composition a bit more. You can do so much more in post processing than you can directly in the render in way less time.
Yeah, and like the whole focus of this tutorial that we did was kind of let's get some focus on the main crying Mary statue here with our little traveler, who's like from ancient Greece, apparently, because that was the scan that I could find. So having that sort of composition where we look at him, look at her, and sort of like, I don't know, the awe-inspiring thing or feeling he gets from looking at this giant statue holding souls right here in her, I guess, bosom. So the first thing is like, we're just going to be turning on and off layers and sort of explaining as we go along. First thing is like, it's sort of working backwards in a bit, because this isn't exactly the way I would work in terms of layers. Sometimes I switch the layers up and down. Like this one, for example, the very first one, rock levels, was just to tone down this rock. It's a very, very simple thing. Just paint a mask for a little rock, and then we, just tone it down just because it was taking too much focus. But then we start building it up like that, really simple. And then with all the simple layers getting added on top, we end up with something a lot more complex. I rendered out 2 passes from Blender, each with their own sort of fog on it. These were just like fog layers with some fog volumes on some planes, and then just sort of like, again, put a mask on these, because then we can mix between them to get the fog exactly how we want. The nice thing with the real-time fog is that it actually gets illuminated by the lights in the scene, so we get a little bit of this highlighting on the fog. And then like it's like with everything we do, like when we do sculpting or something like that, the first maybe like 20 minutes, half an hour of a paint over or a sculpt, that's where you see the most change. And then the end, like the last 10% or even 5%, that's like the little highlights and the little particles that overall don't add that much to the image. It just helps ground it just a little bit more. So first overpaint here, quite drastic. We had a lot of focus on this statue over here. This was quite intense in terms of the light, and I just wanted to make the focus even more clear on the statue here. So you can see that with a little bit of rim, painting in that little, like the souls that she's holding, as well as some focus on her face, kind of like the souls are like shining up on her face here.
I always start off these kind of paint overs with thinking, where do I want the viewer to look? And then I focus all my attention towards that. There's no purpose to having the pillar to the screen left be that visible as it was before, because now it's almost like a tertiary focal point, and it adds nothing to it. So just take it down, and it's way easier to do this just with a black brush in Photoshop than it is to start to do some fancy negative lights or blocking the light in Blender.
Then you like end up with like you have to place a plane up here, but maybe that messes with the fog volumes up here. So in this case, because we're working on it as if it's a concept piece, we're just doing it in Photoshop because it helps convey the emotion that we want to get across anyway. A little bit of rim light on her. That's really all this does. You know, you can see there's some rim where it hits down here and some rim on her. Just again, just to get a little more focus. Then, actually in the same spot, very subtle, we add some particles. I don't know if YouTube compression even lets you see this, but these are very, very, very faint particles that just appear here. And again, like all these small things, they add up. You might not see them, but as you add more and more of them, you'll definitely start to feel them. Then we have some particles. This is like a dodge layer with color dodge on top, just painting on top of where the particles were, just to emphasize those particles just a little bit more. More fog. This was a general big pass for adding fog to the scene, just to, again, tone down some of the areas that I didn't want to draw too much focus to. You can see this part here. It's kind of like a fog vignette that kills some of this light, some of this light, and some of this light. And again, a little bit of fog on her, but fog that's a little lighter, as if we have kind of like what we got for free with the real-time lights. This kind of light here, we're kind of simulating that this is reflecting off of the fog that's near her. Another fog pass just to integrate the base a little bit more and to integrate his torch. And then painting in some rays. These were like really subtle God rays. They were a lot more intense in the beginning, but again, we want to try and keep it subtle, so you can always make something really intense and then, you know, go and turn down the opacity or something. Highlight particles on the statue or like around the statue, just to like kind of like get this wet feel as if something's been dripping down on her, and then particles, they fly up. And then we fade this top statue over here just to break up the shape a little bit. It was annoying me, I suppose. And then really quickly, I just painted in like this one piece of fire. It's just like some yellows, and I think I had some color dodging on top just to emphasize some of the color, and then duplicating that around just like the other torches just so we have some light, but fading them down behind the fog as well, just so they don't take too much focus. It's not like super realistic to fade down lights, but we can do whatever we want in concepting just to not draw too much attention.
This is also where you have to figure out what should you do in 2D and what should you do in 3D. It is infinitely easier to art direct something like smoke or fire in 2D. You can even like take a picture, just Google fire and put her in, set it to screen and just put her in there. It's so much easier than trying to set up some effects or some stuff like that in Blender. Just use like input output here when it comes to these illustrations.
Yeah, I remember when I was doing the live stream, a lot of people had really good ideas, obviously, for how to solve a lot of the technical problems inside of Blender, but at some point, like Henning says, you also just have to make a judgment call and be like, well, it's not worth me setting up a bunch of camera facing planes or something with some volumes and lights in them to make them simulate fire, when I can just in 20 seconds just paint in something that kind of resembles fire. Like, this gets the point across, and that's the important part in concepting. It's not to make a technically perfect picture, it's just to be able to sell whatever emotion it is that you have in your head and get that across. Now, so you might think like, okay, when I'm doing a 3D piece and I'm doing something for my portfolio, I want to do everything in the render and then present it. But even for us, I mean, basically all our portfolio pieces, we've done some kind of paint over. It doesn't matter if I'm doing a sculpture and then a render of a statue. Sometimes I'll still go in and do a paint over just to like, okay, I didn't quite like the shape of the nose on this, and I'll just color pick whatever color is there on the nose just to tweak the nose a little bit. But more importantly is all the color correction and the balancing, which is what we'll get to here. This is where I think it gets really exciting. So first off, we have this levels. That's just to crunch crunch the blacks and accentuate the white highlights in something. So you can see how like we just take all the fog that we had on top before, and we just sort of like just emphasize the highlights and the darks there. So we still have fog, but it's just to bring the bright subjects forward a little bit and then push the darker subjects back, so we create some more depth. Because when you put a lot of fog on top of stuff, it tends to flatten the picture a little bit. So that's kind of the issue I was running into here.
So if you're doing some renders out of your 3D software, it might be ArcGIS or General Sculpture, the quickest way, like in terms of input output, how much time you spend on versus what the quality is to do grading of your image. You know, if you're looking at what Morten is doing here and is thinking that, oh, you don't know how to paint fire, you don't know how to actually paint, you're not that good at composition, just being able to go in and just crunch some colors around, like add some light color grading to it. This kind of stuff is going to dramatically increase the visual quality of your final image.
But just to show you here, this is what this does, right? So it's a pretty simple thing. Sometimes I'll change the black and the white value. This is just to sort of like decrease it, and then you do sort of like the same with the black, where you're like, if you want this more foggy faded look, you can increase the black here, whereas this here is crunching it, right? I'm crunching the white values down towards closer and closer to the black values, so we get more contrast in them, so that they technically get further apart. We're limiting the range in here. Here we have a really big dynamic range from really soft to highlighted, and then here it's very, very limited, right?
When you also crunch it like that, and you can see all the mistakes as well. We're hiding so much here. But then now you can see all these subtle little things in the background.
So that's where like doing dark scenes like this is actually kind of nice, because you can hide a lot of it in the darkness.
I love doing that.
Now, one thing that I think you should do to every single picture that you render out, or if it's an animation, doesn't matter, is color balancing. Because color balancing is almost always wrong when you get it out of the render. It doesn't matter, maybe your greens are a little too much, or usually for me it's like the blues aren't actually where I want them to be. For this one, I wanted to emphasize more that sickly look, because it's Dark Souls and we're underground, like a boss kind of arena. So you can see here that we pulled down some of the blue and combine that with pulling in some of the yellows, and that kind of gives us this little green, or this green feel. But it's a mix of yellow and cyan instead of just cranking up the green, which just makes it look more horror-like. So it's kind of a mix of both. Applying some hue and saturation just to pull it down a little bit. You can see I thought it was a little too intense for everything in the saturation. Another color balance to adjust for the green that we've taken away, just increasing some of the blues. And then a vibrance layer. Now, I really like using a vibrance layer because unlike just a pure hue and saturation, which has a tendency to blow out a lot of your color if you just take it to the max, the vibrance, I have no idea technically how a vibrance layer works. I just know what it looks like. It's kind of like, I feel like it's a saturation layer, but more subtle. Like it doesn't actually crunch my values.
I think it's saturation, but without actually changing the values. I think it respects the luminance of it while still changing the saturation.
So that's why I really like this one.
It's a lovely adjustment layer. I use it all the time.
And then I have one called Green Statue, which is just I'm applying some. This is just a green painted layer that I apply here just to, again, enhance some of that sickly feel. Well, I guess it's a hue and saturation, a color balance layer with a mask on it, just to get that green feel in there. And then finally, a last kind of levels just to undo or fix everything I've done here, which might have messed with a little bit of my levels. I just want to emphasize that again, just to really nail home the focus, which is going to be the Crying Mary statue, and then our little soldier guy here. Then, something that you can also do for big scenes, but not too much, is applying a little bit of vignette. So again, I'm taking down the focus here in the bottom half of the picture, because this is primarily where I want the audience to look. So it's like this faded thing that just grades this down a little bit. Like, it's not realistic to put that on top of something, a light that's this close to the camera. This would be like, if you looked at the levels, this would be 1 in like if you're taking a picture with a camera or something, but we can cheat in concepting to sort of have the focus where we want it to be. Then here's one that everyone went absolutely nuts with in like 2008, I think. It's Chromatic Aberration.
You need some Chromatic Aberration.
So I have two ones here, one called Chromatic Aberration Small and one called Big. So the small one is for everything that's in the outer part of the frame, like the character here. You see how far I actually have to zoom in order to see it? It's a little hard when it's actually moving. You see that? How it sort of like defocuses him. I've also gone ahead and blurred the picture a little bit, just like the regular blur tool. Just blur him a little bit, just so he's not that sharp. It's again kind of a composition trick, just to not have everything in the picture be the same kind of sharpness. You see that being applied here as well. So, and the chromatic aberration helps with that. Now, for the love of everything that's holy, don't overuse this. You don't want to actually be able to really see it when you look at your picture as a whole. Like when you look at it like this, you want to be able to feel the chromatic aberration, but you shouldn't actually be able to distinguish separate channels. Now, for people who aren't really aware of what it does, it just splits the red, green, and blue or magenta or cyan into separate channels and then just sort of like offsets them from each other.
Yeah, you can find it under the lens correction tool under filter and in the second tab, and you can find the chromatic aberration there.
Just got there. So you go lens correction, go to custom. My typical way of doing it is like, I'll just crank it up all the way from the beginning, something like this. And so I'll do these two at 100, for example, and then fix green magenta fringe. Now, because that's the one I'm leaving alone, if we go here, you can see that's actually what it's going to be emphasizing. So if I crank that to the other extreme, right, it's going to be like this weird
crazy
3D picture. Now, if you wanted something like let's say you wanted red and blue, for example, which is very popular, like the 3D kind of look, you could do that. But then what I would do is I would typically start here and then just do like just a little bit like that, maybe. You just feel it, but you don't really notice it.
And this is a byproduct of taking photos with a camera. And if you want something to feel photographic or photorealistic, you often want to include some of these mistakes. There could be some lens distortion, chromatic aberration. There can be some depth of field, some blur to it. Because like we mentioned in the offset of the video, the problem with a lot of 3D renders is they're so sharp and it just doesn't look right. They're sharpened to perfection and you really want areas to be soft. It just makes it a lot more comfortable to look at.
Yeah. And then I have another one, which is chromatic big, where I've emphasized it a little more. And this is for our statue here. So just so it because it's in the center of basically what happens when you're taking a photo with a camera is like the closer you get to the edge, the more chromatic aberration you'll have with crappier lenses. The better the lens, typically the more expensive lenses, they'll do a really good job at minimizing chromatic aberration. So it's to do with how the light sort of enters the lens and where there are artifacts or defects, right? So anything in the center of the screen like this one won't get as much chromatic aberration. So I do a separate pass here, just where I increase the chromatic aberration and then I have a mask on it just to paint it out so it's just the statue here that gets it. And then we do a noise layer. Now a little trick, usually I'll fill a layer with 50% gray and then come up to filter, do noise, add noise, and then I'll set the layer to overlay. That way anything that's gray it's basically like cut out by the overlay and you're only left with the nice subtle noise that you've applied in here. And you can see I've also taken it all the way down to 10% just to really make sure that I only get a little bit of noise. I don't want this crazy noisy picture or like film grainy one. Just a little bit of like grain in there.
Just makes it a bit more photographic right away.
Yeah. And then I have a sharpen, which goes on top of the focus point. So again, it's one of those, I guess, composition tricks just to try to get to draw the eye in, so like draw it up the staircase and up to the statue. So you can see how it sort of just sharpens these areas up a little bit. Again, with a mask on it, just to paint it away. So you can see all the white areas is where I leave the mask alone, and the black areas are where I don't want that sharpen to happen, like the fire, this torch here, and I don't want it right there either. So it's just to guide your eye a little bit. And then I have a letterbox on top just to make it more cinematic, I guess. That was like the idea behind that. And then eventually we end up with that. Through all of these things, and if we look at it from the beginning, this is where we came from. A decent picture, especially when you're considering it came out of Blender with a real-time renderer like Eevee. We have everything for free, basically. Perspective, we have color and light information, the size, the scale between everything. Because I use 3D scans, we have so much detail in there that like I could never even paint because I'm not that good of a painter. But what I can do is I can manipulate an image, right? So before and then after. So obviously, maybe you can mix these two together if you're not completely sold on the sort of like the other end of the extreme. But that's the nice thing about doing this in post, is that you can always tweak it and edit it and make it better, basically.
And we're not cheating. This is not a cheat for it. Like, you're already using 3D. You're already cheating. if you want to, like, where does the cheating stop? So everything which makes the picture look more appealing, that's all good game for you. You can even do a lot of this if you have 3D scenes as well. This is done a lot. Then you would do it in Nuke instead of in Photoshop, but you can do a lot of the exact same things in like for fully animated scenes.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're doing any kind of 3D or any kind of picture, it doesn't really matter. I would always recommend taking it into Photoshop and just doing some kind of correction on it. Just a little bit of levels and a little bit of color balance at the minimum, just because it can really help enhance it. I mean, you will need practice, and most of the time when people get started with this, they overdo it in the beginning, I would say. It's too much contrast and it becomes too crazy, but it's a learning experience, and you just gotta have to develop an eye for what looks good in this kind of scenario. So yeah, make sure to check out the series. We'll link it down below if you want to check it out. And if you want to see more breakdowns like this in the future, make sure to comment down below, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. If you're looking for training or high quality assets, make sure to stop by the FlippedNormals marketplace. And if you're interested in supporting us by buying our merchandise, you can check that out in the description below.